The courtroom was silent, so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Everyone was waiting for Judge Harold Thompson to speak. He was known for being strict, but no one expected what happened next. In front of the judge stood a man named James Carter, a disabled veteran who had served his country for over 20 years. James had lost his leg in combat, and now he walked with a prosthetic. He was in court because of a small mistake. He had parked his car in a spot reserved for disabled people, but his disability permit had expired. James had tried to explain this to the judge, but Judge Thompson didn't seem to care. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice cold and sharp, "the law is the law. You broke it, and now you must face the consequences." James stood tall, but his hands were shaking. "Your Honor, I didn't mean to break the law. I've been trying to renew my permit, but the paperwork got delayed. I'm a veteran, and I've always tried to do the right thing. Please, just give me a little more time." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Being a veteran doesn't make you above the law. In fact, I find it disrespectful that you would use your service as an excuse. You should know better." The room gasped. James's face turned red, not from anger, but from shame. He had given so much for his country, and now he was being treated like a criminal. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel on the desk. "I find you guilty. You will pay a fine of $500, and if you can't pay it, you'll spend 30 days in jail." The room erupted in whispers. James's heart sank. He didn't have $500. He barely had enough money to pay his rent. He looked around the courtroom, hoping someone would speak up for him, but no one did. As the bailiff led James out of the courtroom, the judge added one last comment. "Maybe this will teach you to respect the law, Mr. Carter." James felt like the world was closing in on him. He had always been proud of his service, but now he felt like it meant nothing. He had fought for his country, but his country didn't seem to care about him. Outside the courtroom, James sat on a bench, trying to figure out what to do. He didn't have any family to help him, and his friends were all struggling too. He felt alone, like no one in the world cared about him. But little did James know, someone in the courtroom had been watching everything. Someone who wasn't going to let this injustice go unnoticed. Someone who had the power to change everything. Who was this person? And what were they planning to do? James had no idea, but his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the story, to see how James ended up in this situation. James Carter had always been a man of honor. He joined the Army when he was just 18 years old, eager to serve his country. He had been deployed to some of the most dangerous places in the world, and he had always done his duty without complaint. But everything changed during his last mission. It was a hot, dusty day in the desert. James and his team were on a routine patrol when they were ambushed. There was an explosion, and everything went black. When James woke up, he was in a hospital bed, and his leg was gone. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, but James didn't feel lucky. He felt broken. After he was discharged from the Army, James struggled to adjust to civilian life. He had nightmares about the explosion, and he often felt like he didn't belong anymore. But he tried to stay positive. He got a job as a security guard, and he even started volunteering at a local veterans center. He wanted to help others who were going through the same things he was. But life wasn't easy. James's job didn't pay much, and he was always struggling to make ends meet. He lived in a small apartment, and he didn't have a car, so he had to take the bus everywhere. But he never complained. He was just grateful to be alive. One day, James got a letter in the mail. It was from the Department of Motor Vehicles, and it said that his disability parking permit was about to expire. James knew he needed to renew it, but he didn't have the money to pay the fee. He decided to wait until his next paycheck, but by then, it was too late. That's how James ended up in court. He had parked in a disabled spot at the grocery store, and a police officer had noticed that his permit was expired. James tried to explain, but the officer didn't listen. He gave James a ticket and told him he would have to go to court. James was nervous about going to court, but he thought the judge would understand. He had always tried to do the right thing, and he didn't think he would be punished for a simple mistake. But he was wrong. And now, as he sat on the bench outside the courtroom, James felt like he had hit rock bottom. He didn't know what to do or where to turn. But just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, Something happened that would change everything. A woman walked up to him. She was wearing a suit, and she had a kind smile on her face. "Mr. Carter," she said, "my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a reporter, and I was in the courtroom today. I saw what happened, and I want to help you." James looked up at her, confused. "Help me? How?" Sarah sat down next to him. "I think what happened to you today was wrong, and I want to tell your story. If people hear about what you've been through, maybe they'll realize how unfair this is. Maybe we can make things right." James didn't know what to say. He had always been a private person, and the idea of telling his story to the world made him nervous. But he also knew that he didn't have any other options. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." Sarah smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I promise we're going to make this right." But as they sat there talking, neither of them noticed the man watching them from across the street. He was wearing a dark coat, and his face was hidden under a hat. He had been following James since he left the courtroom, and he wasn't planning to let him go so easily. Who was this man? And what did he want with James? The answers to these questions would come soon, but for now, James had no idea what was about to happen. All he knew was that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. And as the sun set over the city, James felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that things were about to get much, much worse. James and Sarah sat on the bench outside the courthouse, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Sarah had just offered to help James by sharing his story, and though he was hesitant, he agreed. He didn't know what else to do. As they talked, Sarah pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down details about James's life. His military service, his injury, and the struggles he faced after returning home. She wanted to paint a full picture of who he was, not just the man who had been disrespected in court. "Tell me about your time in the army," Sarah said gently. "What was it like?" James hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. He told her about the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, and the pride he felt serving his country. But he also spoke about the fear, the loss, and the moment that changed his life forever. The explosion that took his leg. Sarah listened intently, her pen moving quickly across the page. She could see the pain in James's eyes, but also the strength. He was a man who had been through so much, yet he still carried himself with dignity. As they talked, the man in the dark coat across the street continued to watch them. He had been standing there for a while, his hands in his pockets, his face still hidden. He didn't approach them, but he didn't leave either. It was as if he was waiting for something. James didn't notice him, but Sarah did. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the man standing there. She frowned. "Do you know that guy?" she asked James, nodding toward the street. James turned to look, but by the time he did, the man was gone. "What guy?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Never mind. Probably nothing," but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a while, Sarah closed her notebook and stood up. "I think I have enough to start with," she said. "I'll write up the story and get it published as soon as possible. In the meantime, is there anything else I can do to help you?" James thought for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. I don't want to go to jail. I don't have the money to pay the fine, and I can't afford to lose my job." Sarah nodded. "I'll see what I can do. Maybe we can get the community involved. People care about veterans, James. They'll want to help." James gave her a small smile. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate it." Sarah patted him on the shoulder. "Hang in there, James. We're going to make this right." As Sarah walked away, James sat on the bench for a few more minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. He felt a glimmer of hope, but it was overshadowed by the fear of what might come next. He didn't know if Sarah's story would be enough to change things, but he was grateful that someone was willing to try. Finally, James stood up and started walking toward the bus stop. It was getting late, and he needed to get home. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder a few times, but he didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling lingered. When he reached the bus stop, James sat down on the bench and waited. The street was quiet, with only a few cars passing by. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. The bus would be there soon. But just as he was putting his phone away, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, and his heart skipped a beat. It was the man in the dark coat. He was standing just a few feet away, his face still hidden under the brim of his hat. "James Carter," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. James stood up, his muscles tense. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer. "You've got a lot of people talking about you," he said. "But not everyone likes what they're hearing." James took a step back, his mind racing. "What do you want?" he asked. The man reached into his coat pocket, and for a moment, James thought he was going to pull out a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to James. "Take it," he said. James hesitated, then reached out and took the envelope. It was heavy, and he could feel something solid inside. "What is this?" he asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned around and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. James stood there for a moment, staring at the envelope in his hands. His heart was pounding, and his mind was filled with questions. Who was that man? What was in the envelope? And why had he given it to him? Finally, James opened the envelope and pulled out what was inside. It was a small, black USB drive. There was no note, no explanation, just the drive. James stared at it, his mind racing. What could be on it? And why had it been given to him? He didn't know, but he had a feeling that whatever was on that drive was important. Just then, the bus pulled up to the stop, and the doors opened. James hesitated for a moment, then quickly put the USB drive back in the envelope and shoved it into his pocket. He climbed onto the bus, his mind still spinning. As the bus drove away, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to take another dramatic turn. He didn't know what was on that USB drive, but he knew one thing for sure. It was going to change everything. And as the bus disappeared into the night, the man in the dark coat watched from the shadows, a small smile playing on his lips. He had done his part. Now it was up to James to figure out the rest. But what was on that USB drive? And what did it have to do with James? The answers to those questions would come soon, but for now, James was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of unease. And as the bus carried him home, James couldn't help but wonder, what had he just gotten himself into? James sat on the bus, clutching the envelope in his pocket. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was the man in the dark coat? Why had he given him this USB drive? And most importantly, what was on it? James's fingers twitched with curiosity, but he knew he couldn't open it here. He needed to get home, somewhere private, where he could figure this out. The bus ride felt like it took forever. Every stop seemed to drag on, and James couldn't stop glancing out the window, half expecting to see the mysterious man again. But the streets were quiet, and no one seemed to be following him. Still, the unease in his chest didn't go away. When the bus finally reached his stop, James practically jumped out of his seat. He hurried down the street to his small apartment, his heart pounding the whole way. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and let out a deep breath. He was safe, for now. James pulled the envelope out of his pocket and stared at it for a moment. It felt heavy in his hands, like it held some kind of secret. He walked over to his old laptop, which was sitting on the kitchen table, and turned it on. While it booted up, he opened the envelope and took out the USB drive. It was small and unremarkable, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was about to change everything. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop and waited. A folder popped up on the screen, labeled simply, Evidence. James's heart skipped a beat. Evidence of what? He clicked on the folder, and a list of files appeared. There were videos, documents, and audio recordings. James hesitated for a moment, then clicked on the first video. The screen went black for a second, and then an image appeared. It was a courtroom, the same courtroom James had been in earlier that day. The camera was positioned in the back, so the judge's face was clearly visible. It was Judge Harold Thompson, the man who had disrespected James and sentenced him to a fine he couldn't afford. James leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. What was this? The video showed Judge Thompson talking to someone off camera. The audio was muffled at first, but then it became clear. "You know what to do," the judge was saying. "Make sure the case goes my way. I don't care how you do it, just get it done." The person off camera nodded, and then the video cut off. James stared at the screen, his mind reeling. What had he just watched? It sounded like the judge was involved in something shady, something illegal. But what did it have to do with him? James clicked on the next file, a document. It was a list of names and dates, along with amounts of money. At the top of the page was a heading, Payments to Judge Thompson. James's eyes widened as he scanned the list. It looked like Judge Thompson had been taking bribes, huge amounts of money, to influence his rulings. And James's name was on the list. According to the document, someone had paid the judge to make sure James was found guilty in his case. But why? Who would want to do that? James didn't have any enemies, at least, none that he knew of. He was just a disabled veteran trying to get by. Why would someone go out of their way to ruin his life? James clicked on another file, an audio recording. He turned up the volume and listened closely. It was a conversation between Judge Thompson and another man, someone James didn't recognize. "We need to make an example of him," the man was saying. "He's a veteran, so people will pay attention. If we can show that even someone like him isn't above the law, it'll send a message." "And what about the money?" Judge Thompson asked. "Don't worry about that," the man replied. "You'll get your cut, just like always." The recording ended, and James sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This was bigger than he had thought. It wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message. But who was behind it? And why had they chosen him? James felt a surge of anger. He had served his country, sacrificed so much, and now he was being used as a pawn in some kind of twisted game. But he also felt a glimmer of hope. If he could prove what was going on, if he could expose Judge Thompson and the people behind this, maybe he could clear his name. Maybe he could make things right. But how? He was just one man, with no money and no power. He didn't even know who to trust. The only person who had offered to help him was Sarah, the reporter. Maybe she could help him with this too. James grabbed his phone and quickly dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring. "James," she said, "is everything okay?" "I need your help," James said, his voice urgent. "I have something big, but I don't know what to do with it." "What is it?" Sarah asked. "I can't explain over the phone," James said. "Can you come to my apartment? It's important." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Sarah said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. James hung up the phone and stared at the USB drive. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Judge Thompson get away with this. He was going to fight back, no matter what it took. While James waited for Sarah to arrive, he couldn't sit still. He paced back and forth in his small apartment, his mind racing. He kept thinking about the man in the dark coat. Who was he? And why had he given James this USB drive? Was he trying to help him? Or was this some kind of trap? James didn't have any answers, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed Sarah's help. She was a reporter. She would know what to do with this kind of information. Together, maybe they could expose the truth. When Sarah finally arrived, James let her in and quickly explained what had happened. He showed her the USB drive and the files on his laptop. Sarah's eyes widened as she watched the video and read the documents. "This is huge," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "If we can prove this is real, it could bring down Judge Thompson and whoever is behind this. But how do we prove it?" James asked. "I don't even know where this came from." Sarah thought for a moment. "We'll need to verify the files, make sure they're authentic, and we'll need to find out who gave this to you. But if this is real, James, it could change everything." James nodded, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to fight back, to clear his name, and to make sure no one else had to go through what he had. But as they sat there, planning their next move, neither of them noticed the car parked outside James's apartment. Inside the car, a man was watching them through binoculars. He had been following Sarah since she left the courthouse, and now he had found James. The man picked up his phone and dialed a number. "They're together," he said. "What do you want me to do?" There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end of the line said, "Keep watching them. Don't let them out of your sight." The man nodded and hung up the phone. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving James's apartment. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. And as the night deepened, the tension grew. James and Sarah were about to uncover a conspiracy that went far beyond the courtroom. But they weren't the only ones looking for answers. And the people behind this, whoever they were, weren't going to let them win without a fight. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was just beginning. What would happen next? The answers were coming, but not yet. The story was far from over. James and Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, the glow of the laptop screen casting shadows across their faces. The files on the USB drive were spread out before them, each one more damning than the last. Judge Thompson's voice echoed in their minds, his cold words from the courtroom now paired with the sinister tone from the recordings. It was clear, this wasn't just about James. This was about corruption, power, and a system that had been rigged against people like him. "We need to move carefully," Sarah said, her voice low but steady. "If this gets out before we're ready, they'll bury it and us." James nodded, his jaw tight. "I just don't understand why they're targeting me. I'm nobody. I don't have money or influence. Why go through all this trouble?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the list of names on the document. "It's not about you, James. It's about sending a message. You're a veteran, a symbol of sacrifice and honor. If they can break you, they can show everyone that no one is safe. It's about control." James clenched his fists. "Well, they messed with the wrong guy. I'm not going to let them get away with this." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's the spirit. But we need a plan. We can't just go public with this yet. We need more evidence, more proof. And we need to figure out who gave you this USB drive. Whoever it is, they're taking a huge risk by helping you. They might be in danger too." James thought back to the man in the dark coat. He had seemed so calm, so sure of himself. But there had been something in his eyes, a flicker of fear. Maybe, whoever he was, he had known what he was doing. And he had chosen James for a reason. "What if we reach out to him?" James suggested. "The guy who gave me the drive. Maybe he has more information." Sarah shook her head. "It's too risky. If they're watching you, and I'm sure they are, they'll be waiting for you to make contact. We need to stay under the radar for now." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So what do we do?" Sarah thought for a moment, then pulled out her phone. "I have a friend, a tech expert. He can help us verify the files and see if there's anything else hidden on the drive. If we're going to take this public, we need to be sure it's bulletproof." James nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Sarah made the call, speaking in hushed tones. When she hung up, she turned to James. "He's on his way. In the meantime, we need to stay here and keep a low profile. No calls, no going outside. We don't know who's watching." James agreed, but the thought of sitting still made him restless. He wasn't used to being passive. He was a man of action, someone who faced problems head-on. But he knew Sarah was right. This wasn't a fight he could win with brute force. This was a battle of wits, and he needed to play it smart. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. James tensed, but Sarah reassured him. "That's my friend. He's here to help." She opened the door, and a young man with glasses and a backpack stepped inside. He looked like a college student, but his sharp eyes and confident demeanor suggested he was anything but. "This is Ethan," Sarah said, introducing him to James. "He's the best when it comes to tech." Ethan nodded at James, then got straight to work. He plugged the USB drive into his own laptop and began typing furiously. Lines of code filled the screen, and Ethan's eyes darted back and forth as he analyzed the data. "This is good stuff," Ethan muttered after a few minutes. "Really good. The files are clean. No tampering, no viruses. Whoever put this together knew what they were doing. Can you tell where it came from?" Sarah asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not easily. The drive's been wiped of any metadata. But there's something else here." He clicked on a file James hadn't noticed before. It was a video, but it was encrypted. Ethan worked for a few more minutes, then the video finally played. The screen showed a dimly lit room. A man was sitting at a desk, his face obscured by shadows. But his voice was clear and familiar. "This is just the beginning," the man said. "We need to make sure the public sees what we want them to see. Control the narrative. Control the people." James's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It was the same man from the audio recording, the one who had been talking to Judge Thompson. "Who is that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, James said, but he's the one behind this. He's the one who's pulling the strings. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face pale. This is bigger than I thought. If this gets out, it's going to blow up. But if we're not careful, it's going to blow up in our faces. Sarah nodded. We need to get this to someone who can help us, someone with power and influence. But we can't trust just anyone. If the wrong people find out what we have, we're done. James stood up, pacing the room. What about the media? If we can get this out to the public, they can't cover it up. Sarah shook her head. Not yet. We need to be strategic. If we go public too soon, they'll discredit us before we even get started. We need to build a case, gather more evidence, and make sure we have allies who can protect us. James stopped pacing and turned to face her. So what's the plan? Sarah took a deep breath. First, we need to find out who that man is, the one in the video. If we can identify him, we can start connecting the dots. Second, we need to find out who gave you the USB drive. They're the key to all of this. And third, we need to stay alive long enough to make this happen. James nodded, his resolve hardening. Let's do it. As the night wore on, the three of them worked together, piecing together what they could. Ethan dug deeper into the files, looking for any hidden clues. Sarah made calls, reaching out to contacts who might be able to help. And James tried to remember every detail about the man in the dark coat. Anything that might help them figure out who he was. But as they worked, none of them noticed the car still parked outside. The man inside was growing impatient. He had been watching the apartment for hours, and he knew his bosses wouldn't be happy if he didn't report back soon. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. They're still inside, he said. What do you want me to do? There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end said, wait for my signal, and be ready to move. The man hung up and leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving the apartment. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get a lot more dangerous. Inside the apartment, James, Sarah, and Ethan were so focused on their work that they didn't hear the faint sound of footsteps outside. They didn't see the shadowy figure approaching the door, and they didn't notice the faint click as the lock was picked. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was wearing a mask, and in his hand was a gun. Don't move, he said, his voice cold and steady. James froze, his heart pounding. Sarah and Ethan turned slowly, their faces pale with fear. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. Where is it? He demanded. The USB drive. Hand it over. James's mind raced. If they gave up the drive, they would lose everything. But if they didn't, they might lose their lives. The man raised the gun, pointing it directly at James. I won't ask again. James glanced at Sarah, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the USB drive, holding it out to the man. The man snatched it from his hand and backed toward the door. If you know what's good for you, you'll forget this ever happened, he said. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. James sank into a chair, his hands trembling. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. We fight back, she said. This isn't over. Not even close. But as they sat there, trying to figure out their next move, none of them noticed the small, blinking light on Ethan's laptop. He had made a backup of the files, just in case. And now, that backup might be their only hope. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closing in. What would happen next? The answers were coming, but not yet. The story was far from over. The room was silent except for the faint hum of Ethan's laptop. The intruder was gone, taking the USB drive with him, but the tension in the apartment was thicker than ever. James sat slumped in his chair, his mind racing. They had lost the evidence, or so the masked man thought. But Ethan's backup might be their only lifeline now. Sarah broke the silence, her voice steady but urgent. Ethan, did you get everything? Ethan nodded, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. Yeah, I made a backup before he showed up. All the files are here. But we need to move fast. If they realize we still have this, they'll come back, and next time, they might not be so polite. James stood up, his fists clenched. We can't just sit here. We need to do something. We need to take this to the police or someone who can help. Sarah shook her head. We can't trust the police, James. Not yet. If Judge Thompson is involved, who knows how far this corruption goes? We need to be smart about this. Ethan looked up from his laptop. I might have an idea. There's a guy I know, a journalist who works for a major news outlet. He's done investigative pieces on corruption before. If we can get this to him, he might be able to help us expose it. Sarah's eyes lit up. That could work. But we need to be careful. If they're watching us, they'll be expecting us to make a move. James paced the room, his mind racing. What if we split up? You two take the backup and go to your journalist friend. I'll stay here and keep them distracted. If they're watching me, they'll think we still have nothing. Sarah frowned. That's too risky, James. If they come back, you'll be alone. James stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. I'm not afraid of them. I've been through worse. Besides, if this is going to work, we need to take risks. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but you need to be careful. If anything happens, call me immediately. Ethan quickly transferred the backup files to a secure cloud storage account and handed Sarah a small external drive. This has everything. Keep it safe. Sarah took the drive and slipped it into her bag. Let's go, Ethan. We don't have much time. As they headed for the door, James stopped them. Wait. If something goes wrong, if they catch you, don't try to be heroes. Just get out of there. This is bigger than any of us. Sarah gave him a small smile. We'll be fine, James. Just stay safe. With that, she and Ethan slipped out the door, leaving James alone in the apartment. He locked the door behind them and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. Outside, Sarah and Ethan moved quickly down the street, keeping to the shadows. They didn't speak, but the tension between them was palpable. Every sound made them jump. Every passing car made them glance over their shoulders. They knew they were being watched, but they couldn't let that stop them. After a few blocks, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Hey, it's me. I need your help. Meet us at the usual spot. He hung up and turned to Sarah. He's on his way. Let's keep moving. They continued down the street, their pace quickening. But as they turned a corner, Sarah froze. A black SUV was parked at the end of the block, its engine idling. The windows were tinted, but she could feel eyes watching them. Ethan, she whispered, we need to go. Now. They turned and started walking in the opposite direction, but the SUV's headlights flicked on, illuminating the street. The engine roared as the vehicle began to move toward them. Run, Sarah shouted. They took off down the street, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The SUV sped up, closing the distance between them. Sarah's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder. The vehicle was gaining fast. This way, Ethan yelled, pulling her into an alley. They sprinted through the narrow passage, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The SUV screeched to a halt at the entrance, unable to follow. But they weren't out of danger yet. Sarah and Ethan burst out of the alley and onto another street, their legs burning. They didn't stop until they reached a small, dimly lit cafe. Ethan pushed open the door, and they stumbled inside, collapsing into a booth. Are you okay? Ethan asked, his voice shaky. Sarah nodded, trying to catch her breath. Yeah, but we need to get out of here. They're not going to stop. Ethan glanced out the window, his face pale. We'll wait here for my contact. He should be here soon. Back at the apartment, James sat by the window, watching the street below. He hadn't seen any sign of the masked man or anyone else, but he knew they were out there. He could feel it. His phone buzzed, and he jumped. It was a text from Sarah. We're safe. Meeting contact soon. Stay put. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. At least they were okay. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. James froze, his heart pounding. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. The knock came again, louder this time. James? It's me. James recognized the voice. It was the man in the dark coat, the one who had given him the USB drive. He hesitated, then walked to the door and opened it a crack. The man stood there, his face grim. We need to talk. James stepped aside, letting him in. What are you doing here? You gave me the drive, and now it's gone. They took it. The man nodded. I know, but you still have the backup, don't you? James's eyes narrowed. How do you know about that? The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. This is a signal jammer. It'll block any surveillance in the area. We need to move quickly. They're coming for you. James's heart raced. Who's coming? The man's expression darkened. The people behind this. They're not going to let you expose them. If you want to survive, you need to come with me. Now. James hesitated, then grabbed his jacket. Let's go. As they slipped out of the apartment and into the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The man in the dark coat led him down a series of alleys and side streets, moving quickly and silently. Who are you? James finally asked as they stopped in a shadowy corner. The man turned to him, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that we stop them. And to do that, we need to trust each other. James nodded, though he still had 1,000 questions. What's the plan? The man handed him a small earpiece. Put this in. We're going to meet someone who can help us. But we need to move fast. They're already on their way. As James put in the earpiece, he heard a faint voice on the other end. James, can you hear me? It was Sarah. Sarah? James said, his voice filled with relief. Where are you? We're safe, she replied. But we need to meet up. There's something you need to see. The man in the dark coat nodded. Let's go. We don't have much time. As they moved through the shadows, James couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for them. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closing in. But for the first time, he felt like they had a chance, a real chance to fight back. James followed the man in the dark coat through the maze of alleys, his heart pounding with every step. The earpiece crackled slightly as Sarah's voice came through again, calm but urgent. James, we're at the old warehouse on 5th and Elm. Ethan's contact is here. He's got something you need to see. The man in the dark coat glanced back at James. We're close. Stay alert. James nodded, his senses on high alert. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he forced himself to focus. Whatever was waiting for them at the warehouse, he needed to be ready. When they finally reached the warehouse, the man in the dark coat gestured for James to wait. He pulled out a small device and scanned the area, then nodded. It's clear. Let's go. They slipped inside through a side door, the dim light of the warehouse casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah and Ethan were waiting near a table, along with a man James didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp features and a serious expression. This had to be Ethan's journalist contact. James, Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. This is Daniel Harper. He's the investigative reporter I told you about. Daniel stepped forward, extending his hand. James, I've heard a lot about you. We need to talk. James shook his hand, his grip firm. What's going on? What do you have? Daniel gestured to the table, where a laptop was open. On the screen was a video, the same one James had seen earlier, of the shadowy figure talking about controlling the narrative. But this time, the video didn't end there. It continued, showing the man stepping into the light. James's breath caught in his throat. The man was someone he recognized, a powerful businessman named Victor Kaine. He was a billionaire with ties to politicians, law enforcement, and even the military. If he was involved in this, it explained everything. Victor Kaine, Daniel said, his voice low. He's the one pulling the strings. He's been using Judge Thompson and others to manipulate the system for years. And you, James, you're just the latest pawn in his game. James stared at the screen, his mind racing. Why me? Why would someone like him care about a disabled veteran? Daniel leaned in, his eyes intense. Because you're a symbol, James. Veterans are respected, admired. If they can break you, they can send a message to everyone else. No one is safe. It's about control. And Victor Kaine is all about control. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. We have the evidence. We have the files, the recordings, everything. But if we're going to take this public, We need to be smart about it. We need to make sure it's airtight. Daniel nodded. I can help with that, but we need to move fast. If Kaine finds out we have this, he'll do everything in his power to stop us. The man in the dark coat, who had been silent until now, spoke up. We need to get this to someone who can protect us. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated. James turned to him. Who? The man hesitated, then said, There's a federal agent, Agent Morales. She's been investigating Kaine for years. If we can get this to her, she can help us bring him down. Sarah frowned. How do we know we can trust her? The man's expression was grim. We don't. But she's our best shot. James looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had risked everything to help him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Victor Kaine win. Let's do it, James said, his voice firm. Let's take this to Agent Morales. As they left the warehouse, the tension in the air was palpable. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. The man in the dark coat led the way, his movements precise and deliberate. They were just a few blocks from the federal building when it happened. A black SUV screeched around the corner, its headlights blinding. The doors flew open, and men in masks jumped out, guns drawn. Run! The man in the dark coat shouted. They scattered, diving for cover as gunfire erupted. James grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into an alley, his heart pounding. Ethan and Daniel were close behind, while the man in the dark coat stayed back, returning fire. We need to keep moving, James yelled, dragging Sarah deeper into the alley. But as they reached the other end, another SUV blocked their path. More men jumped out, their guns trained on James and the others. Hand over the files, one of the men said, his voice cold. Now. James stepped forward, shielding Sarah with his body. You're not getting anything. The man raised his gun, aiming it directly at James. Wrong answer. Before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out. The man dropped to the ground, and chaos erupted. James turned to see the man in the dark coat standing at the other end of the alley, his gun smoking. Go, he shouted. I'll hold them off. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's hand and ran, Ethan and Daniel close behind. They didn't stop until they reached the federal building, where Agent Morales was waiting. James Carter, she asked, her eyes narrowing. James nodded, breathless. We have evidence. Victor Kaine. He's behind all of this. Agent Morales took the external drive from Sarah and handed it to one of her agents. Get this analyzed. Now. As they were led inside, James glanced back at the street, his heart heavy. The man in the dark coat was still out there, fighting to give them a chance. And as the doors closed behind them, James knew one thing for sure. The fight was far from over. The federal building was a fortress of steel and glass, its sterile halls buzzing with activity. James, Sarah, Ethan, and Daniel were ushered into a secure conference room, where Agent Morales wasted no time. She plugged the external drive into a secure terminal and began reviewing the files, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. This is bigger than I thought, she muttered, her eyes scanning the screen. Victor Kaine's reach goes deeper than we realized. He's not just manipulating the courts. He's got his hands in law enforcement, the media, even some branches of the military. James leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What does that mean for us? Can you take him down? Agent Morales looked up, her gaze steady. We can try, but we need to be careful. If Kaine finds out we have this, he'll do everything in his power to stop us. And he's got the resources to make us disappear. Sarah crossed her arms, her voice firm. We're not backing down. Not after everything we've been through. Ethan nodded in agreement. We've got the evidence. We just need to make sure it gets out. Daniel, the journalist, spoke up. I can help with that. If we can get this to my editor, we can run a story that'll blow this wide open. But we need to act fast. Agent Morales hesitated, then nodded. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'll coordinate with my team to secure the evidence and build a case. Daniel, you work on the story, but don't publish anything until I give the green light. We need to time this perfectly. James stood up, his voice filled with determination. What about me? What can I do? Agent Morales looked at him, her expression softening slightly. You've done enough, James. You brought this to us. Now let us handle it. James shook his head. No, this isn't just about me anymore. This is about everyone Kaine has hurt. I'm not going to sit back and do nothing. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. James, you've already risked so much. Let us take it from here. But James wasn't having it. I'm not asking for permission. I'm going to help, whether you like it or not. Agent Morales studied him for a moment, then sighed. All right, but you need to follow my lead. No heroics. Understood? James nodded. Understood. As the team began to divide tasks, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. He stepped out into the hallway, his mind racing. The man in the dark coat, the one who had given him the USB drive, was still out there, and James couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? And why had he risked so much to help them? As if on cue, James's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Come alone. James stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He knew it had to be the man in the dark coat. But could he trust him? And more importantly, could he afford not to? He slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the conference room. The others were deep in discussion, and no one noticed when he slipped out a few minutes later. He didn't tell them where he was going. He knew they'd try to stop him, and he couldn't let that happen. The docks were quiet at midnight, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the piers. James stood in the shadows, his eyes scanning the area. He didn't have to wait long. The man in the dark coat emerged from the darkness, his face still hidden under the brim of his hat. You came, he said, his voice low. James stepped forward, his fists clenched. Who are you? And why are you helping us? The man hesitated, then reached up and pulled off his hat. James's eyes widened as he recognized the face staring back at him. It was someone he hadn't seen in years, someone he thought was dead. Tom, James whispered, his voice trembling. Tom Reynolds. Tom nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, it's me. Long time no see, James. James took a step back, his mind reeling. Tom had been his best friend in the army, his brother in arms. But he had been declared MIA after a mission gone wrong. James had mourned him, had carried the weight of his loss for years. And now, here he was, standing in front of him. How are you alive? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom's eyes were filled with pain. It's a long story, but the short version is, I didn't die. I was captured, and when I finally got out, I found out the truth about Victor Kaine, about what he's been doing. I've been working to take him down ever since. James shook his head, still struggling to process what he was hearing. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why all the secrecy? Tom sighed. Because Kaine's got eyes everywhere. If he found out I was alive, he'd come after me, and anyone connected to me. I couldn't risk it. But when I heard about what happened to you in court, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him destroy you too. James felt a surge of anger. You should have told me. I could have helped. Tom shook his head. I didn't want to drag you into this. But now that you're here, we need to move fast. Kaine's already onto us. He knows we have the evidence, and he's not going to stop until he gets it back. James clenched his fists. Then let's finish this. Together. Tom nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Just like old times, huh? As they left the docks, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But he didn't care. He had his friend back, and together, they were going to take down Victor Kaine. But as they disappeared into the night, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows. Victor Kaine's men were closing in, and the fight was far from over. James and Tom moved through the darkened streets, sticking to the shadows as they made their way to a safe house Tom had set up. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of relief and unresolved history. James had so many questions, but now wasn't the time. They had a mission to focus on. The safe house was a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet part of the city. Inside, the walls were lined with maps, photos, and documents, all evidence of Tom's years-long investigation into Victor Kaine. This is where I've been working, Tom said, gesturing to the cluttered room. It's not much, but it's kept me alive. James scanned the room, his eyes landing on a photo of Victor, Kaine surrounded by high-ranking officials. "You've been busy." Tom nodded. Kaine's network is massive. He's got politicians, judges, even some law enforcement in his pocket. Taking him down won't be easy. James turned to him, his expression serious. "We've got the evidence. Agent Morales is building a case. If we can get this to the right people, we can expose him." Tom shook his head. "It's not that simple. Kaine's got spies everywhere. If we're not careful, he'll find out what we're doing before we can make a move." James crossed his arms. "So what's the plan?" Tom walked over to a map pinned to the wall. It was marked with red circles and notes. "Kaine's hosting a fundraiser tomorrow night. It's his annual charity gala, a who's who of the city's elite. If we can get inside, we can plant a device that'll give us access to his private servers. That's where the real evidence is." James raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about breaking into Kaine's gala? That's suicide." Tom smirked. "Not if we do it right. I've got a contact who can get us in. All we need to do is plant the device and get out without being noticed." James hesitated. The plan was risky, but he knew they didn't have many options. "All right, let's do it." The next evening, James and Tom stood outside the Grand Hotel where the gala was being held. The building was lit up like a beacon, with valets rushing to park luxury cars and guests in tuxedos and gowns streaming through the doors. Tom handed James a small earpiece. "This will keep us connected. Stick to the plan, and don't do anything stupid." James nodded, adjusting the earpiece. "Got it." They slipped inside through a service entrance, blending in with the staff. Tom had arranged for them to pose as waiters, giving them access to the event without drawing attention. As they moved through the crowded ballroom, James couldn't help but feel out of place. The room was filled with the city's most powerful people, all laughing and chatting like they didn't have a care in the world. It was a stark contrast to the danger lurking just beneath the surface. Tom's voice crackled in James's earpiece. "Kaine's office is on the 3rd floor. We need to get up there without being seen." James nodded subtly, making his way toward the stairs. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he carried a tray of champagne glasses. The plan was to use the tray as a cover, but his heart was pounding so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. As he reached the 3rd floor, he spotted 2 guards standing outside a door. That had to be Kaine's office. "I've got eyes on the target," James whispered into the earpiece. 2 guards. "What's the move?" Tom's voice was calm. "Distract them. I'll handle the rest." James took a deep breath, then walked toward the guards, holding out the tray. "Champagne, gentlemen?" The guards glanced at each other, then shook their heads. "No thanks. This area's off-limits." James feigned confusion. "Oh, sorry. I must have taken a wrong turn." As he turned to leave, he accidentally dropped the tray. The glasses shattered on the floor, and the guards instinctively looked down. That was all the distraction Tom needed. In a flash, Tom appeared behind the guards, disarming them with swift, precise movements. Within seconds, they were unconscious on the floor. James stared at him, impressed. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Tom smirked. "Long story. Let's move." They slipped into Kaine's office, closing the door behind them. The room was opulent, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But James didn't have time to admire the view. He immediately began searching for the server. Tom pulled out a small device and plugged it into Kaine's computer. "This should give us access to his files. It'll take a few minutes to download everything." James kept watch by the door, his ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. The seconds felt like hours as they waited for the device to do its work. Finally, Tom pulled the device out and pocketed it. "Got it. Let's go." They slipped back into the hallway, but as they reached the stairs, they heard voices coming from below. James's heart sank. They were trapped. Tom grabbed his arm and pulled him into a nearby storage closet. They pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath as the voices grew louder. "I don't care what it takes," a man's voice said. "Find them. Kaine wants them dealt with." James recognized the voice. It was one of Kaine's top enforcers. They were in serious trouble. Tom whispered into the earpiece. "We've got company. We need another way out." James glanced around the closet, his eyes landing on a ventilation grate. What about that? Tom followed his gaze and nodded. Good thinking. They quickly removed the grate and climbed into the ventilation shaft, crawling as quietly as they could. The voices faded behind them, but James knew they weren't out of the woods yet. After what felt like an eternity, they finally emerged onto the roof. The cool night air was a relief after the cramped, dusty shaft. Tom pulled out his phone and dialed a number. We're on the roof. We need extraction. James looked at him, confused. Extraction? Who are you calling? Tom didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the sky. A moment later, a helicopter appeared, its searchlight scanning the roof. James stared at him, stunned. You've got a helicopter? Tom grinned. I told you, I've been busy. As the helicopter landed, James couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They had the evidence. They had a way out. And for the first time, it felt like they might actually win. But as they climbed into the helicopter and it lifted off, James glanced back at the hotel. Somewhere in that building, Victor Kaine was still plotting, still scheming. And James knew the fight was far from over. The helicopter soared over the city, its blades slicing through the night air. James sat in the back, clutching the device they had stolen from Victor Kaine's office. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. They had pulled off the impossible, infiltrating Kaine's Gala, accessing his private servers, and escaping without being caught. But James knew this was only the beginning. Tom sat across from him, his expression focused as he spoke into a headset. We've got the files. Meet us at the rendezvous point. James leaned forward. Who are we meeting? Tom glanced at him. Someone who can help us make sense of this. We need to analyze the data and figure out our next move. James nodded, though he still had 1,000 questions. He trusted Tom, but the secrecy was starting to wear on him. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. The helicopter landed on the roof of a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. As they climbed out, James noticed a figure waiting for them. A woman in a dark suit, her arms crossed. She looked familiar, but James couldn't place her. James, this is Agent Morales, Tom said, gesturing to the woman. She's been working with me to take down Kaine. James's eyes widened. You've been working with her this whole time? Agent Morales stepped forward, her expression serious. We didn't have a choice. Kaine's network is too powerful. We had to keep this quiet until we had enough evidence to move. James shook his head, still trying to process everything. So what now? Now, Agent Morales said, we see what's on that device. They moved inside the building, which turned out to be a secure federal facility. The walls were lined with monitors, and agents bustled about, their faces grim. James felt out of place, but he forced himself to focus. This was bigger than him now. Tom handed the device to a technician, who plugged it into a computer. The room fell silent as the files began to load. What they saw was staggering. Emails, financial records, video recordings, all of it pointed to a vast conspiracy orchestrated by Victor Kaine. He had been bribing officials, manipulating the media, and even orchestrating crimes to further his agenda. The evidence was damning, and it implicated some of the most powerful people in the city. James stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This is it. This is what we need to take him down. Agent Morales nodded. It's a start, but we need to be careful. If Kaine finds out we have this, he'll do everything in his power to stop us. Tom crossed his arms. We need to get this to the press. If we can expose him publicly, it'll be harder for him to cover it up. Agent Morales hesitated. It's risky. If we move too soon, he could destroy the evidence before it gets out. James stepped forward. We don't have a choice. We can't let him get away with this. Agent Morales studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we need to time this perfectly. One wrong move and we're done. As the team began to plan their next steps, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on a monitor showing the building's security feed. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of the screen, but when he looked closer, it was gone. James! Tom's voice pulled him back to the present. You okay? James nodded, though his unease lingered. Yeah, just nervous, I guess. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. We've got this. We're closer than we've ever been. James forced a smile, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Later that night, James found himself alone in a small break room, trying to clear his head. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the dark coat, Tom, his best friend, his brother in arms, who he had thought was dead. It was still hard to believe he was really here. As he sat there, lost in thought, the door opened and Sarah walked in. She looked tired, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" James nodded. "Yeah. Just a lot to process." Sarah sat down across from him, her expression sympathetic. "I can't even imagine what you're going through. Finding out Tom's alive. All of this. It's a lot." James sighed. "I just wish I knew what to do next. We've got the evidence, but it feels like we're still one step behind." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "You're not alone, James. We're in this together, and we're going to take Kaine down." James looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled. "You'd probably be in a lot more trouble." They both laughed, the tension easing for a moment. But as James looked into her eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The next morning, the team gathered in the main room to finalize their plan. Agent Morales stood at the front, her expression serious. "We're going public today," she said. "Daniel's story will run in the afternoon, and we'll release the evidence to the press. Once it's out, Kaine won't be able to stop it." James felt a surge of hope. This was it. They were finally going to expose Victor Kaine for the monster he was. But as they began to prepare, an alarm blared through the building. The lights flickered, and the monitors went dark. "What's going on?" James asked, his heart racing. Agent Morales grabbed her radio. "Report. What's happening?" A panicked voice came through the speakers. "We've been breached. Someone's inside the building." James's blood ran cold. He turned to Tom, who was already moving toward the door. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice urgent. "Now." But before they could react, the door burst open, and armed men stormed in. They were wearing black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind masks. James recognized them immediately. They were Kaine's men. "Hands up," one of them shouted, his gun trained on James. James raised his hands, his mind racing. How had they found them? And more importantly, how were they going to get out of this? As the men began to search the room, James's eyes met Tom's. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. The room was chaos. Kaine's men moved with military precision, disarming the federal agents and securing the area. James's heart pounded as he scanned the room, looking for a way out. His eyes locked with Tom's, and in that split second, they shared an unspoken plan. Tom gave a barely perceptible nod, and James knew what he had to do. He dropped to the floor, rolling behind a desk as gunfire erupted. Tom and Agent Morales followed suit, taking cover and returning fire. "We need to get to the server room," Agent Morales shouted over the noise. "If they destroy the evidence, it's over." James nodded, his mind racing. The server room was down the hall, but getting there would be nearly impossible with Kaine's men blocking the way. Tom grabbed a flashbang grenade from his belt and pulled the pin. "Cover your eyes," he yelled, tossing it into the center of the room. The explosion was deafening, and the room filled with blinding light. James used the distraction to sprint toward the door, Tom and Agent Morales close behind. They burst into the hallway, only to find more of Kaine's men waiting for them. "This way," Tom shouted, pulling James down a side corridor. They ran through the maze of hallways, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. James's lungs burned, but he pushed himself to keep going. They couldn't afford to stop. Finally, they reached the server room. Tom slammed the door shut behind them and locked it, but they all knew it wouldn't hold for long. "We need to upload the files to a secure server," Agent Morales said, rushing to a terminal. "If we can get them out of here, Kaine won't be able to destroy them." James watched as she began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The sound of pounding on the door made his heart race. "How much time do you need?" Tom asked, his gun trained on the door. 2 minutes, Agent Morales replied, her voice tense. Tom nodded. "We'll hold them off." James grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, his mind racing. He wasn't a soldier like Tom, but he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. The door shook as Kaine's men tried to break it down. Tom fired a few shots through the door, forcing them to back off, but it was only a matter of time before they got through. "James," Tom said, his voice calm but urgent. "When they come in, aim for the legs. We need to slow them down, not kill them." James nodded, gripping the fire extinguisher tightly. "Got it." The door burst open, and Kaine's men poured in. Tom fired, taking out 2 of them before they could react. James swung the fire extinguisher, knocking another man off his feet. The room was chaos, but they held their ground. "Almost there," Agent Morales shouted. James ducked as a bullet whizzed past his head. He swung the fire extinguisher again, hitting another man in the knee. The man cried out and fell to the ground. Tom grabbed a smoke grenade from his belt and tossed it into the hallway. The room filled with thick smoke, giving them a moment of cover. "Done," Agent Morales yelled. "Let's go." Tom grabbed James's arm and pulled him toward a ventilation grate in the corner of the room. "This way." They crawled into the ventilation shaft, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. James's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to keep moving. They couldn't stop now. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged onto the roof. The cool night air was a relief after the cramped, dusty shaft. James took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "We need to get out of here," Agent Morales said, pulling out her phone. "I'll call for extraction." Tom shook his head. "No time. They'll be watching the exits. We need to find another way." James glanced around the roof, his eyes landing on a fire escape on the side of the building. "What about that?" Tom nodded. "Let's move." They climbed down the fire escape, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. When they reached the ground, they slipped into the shadows, staying out of sight. "Where to now?" James asked, his voice low. Tom glanced around, then pointed to a nearby alley. "This way. I've got a car stashed nearby." They moved through the alley, staying close to the walls. James's senses were on high alert, every sound making him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. As they reached the end of the alley, Tom stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Wait." James froze, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Tom pointed to the street ahead. A black SUV was parked at the corner, its engine idling. Kaine's men were waiting for them. "We need to go around," Tom whispered. But before they could move, a voice called out from behind them. "Going somewhere?" James turned to see a man stepping out of the shadows. He was tall, with a cold, calculating expression. James recognized him immediately. It was Victor Kaine. Kaine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, James. But it's over now." James clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "You're not going to get away with this, Kaine. We've got the evidence." "It's over for you." Kaine chuckled. "Oh, James, you really think a few files are going to stop me? I own this city, and soon I'll own you." Tom stepped forward, his gun trained on Kaine. "Back off, Kaine. This ends now." Kaine's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. "You're out of your league, soldier. But if you want to play, let's play." He snapped his fingers, and more men appeared, surrounding them. James's heart sank. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But just as Kaine's men moved in, a loud crash echoed through the alley. A van came barreling around the corner, its headlights blinding. The doors flew open, and Sarah jumped out, holding a shotgun. "Get in," she shouted. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Agent Morales and pulled her toward the van, Tom covering them with gunfire. They climbed in, and Sarah hit the gas, speeding away from the scene. As they drove through the city, James looked back at the alley, his mind racing. They had escaped, but Kaine was still out there. And he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. "We need to get this evidence out," Agent Morales said, her voice firm. "Now." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the wheel. "I've got a contact at the news station. We can get it on the air tonight." James leaned back in his seat, his heart still pounding. They were so close, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The van screeched to a halt outside a small, unmarked building on the edge of the city. Sarah killed the engine and turned to face the group, her expression serious. This is it. My contact's inside. We need to move fast. James nodded, his heart still racing from the narrow escape. He glanced at Tom and Agent Morales, who both looked equally determined. They had come too far to back down now. As they entered the building, they were greeted by a man in his late 30s with glasses and a harried expression. He introduced himself as Mark, Sarah's contact at the news station. "You've got the evidence?" Mark asked, his eyes darting to the device in Agent Morales' hand. She nodded. "Everything we need to take down Victor Kaine. But we need to get it on the air before he can stop us." Mark led them to a small studio filled with equipment. "This is our backup broadcast station. It's off the grid, so Kaine's people won't be able to trace it. But once we go live, there's no turning back." James took a deep breath. "Let's do it." As Mark set up the equipment, James pulled Sarah aside. "Are you sure about this? Once we expose Kaine, there's no telling how he'll react." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We don't have a choice, James. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep hurting people. We have to do this." James squeezed her hand. "I just don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me." Sarah smiled faintly. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone Kaine has hurt. We're doing this for them." James nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. She was right. This was bigger than him now. In the studio, Mark gave them the signal. "We're live in 10 seconds. James, Sarah, Tom, and Agent Morales stood in front of the camera, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. James felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was their moment. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Mark gave them the go-ahead. Agent Morales stepped forward, her voice steady and authoritative. "My name is Agent Laura Morales of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What you are about to see is evidence of a conspiracy orchestrated by Victor Kaine, a man who has used his power and influence to manipulate the system for his own gain." She held up the device, and the screen behind her lit up with images of emails, financial records, and video recordings. The evidence was damning, and it painted a picture of corruption that went all the way to the top. James stepped forward next, his voice filled with emotion. "My name is James Carter. I'm a disabled veteran, and I've spent my life serving this country. But when I stood up to Victor Kaine, he tried to destroy me. He tried to silence me, but I'm not going to let him win. This is for everyone who's been hurt by his greed and corruption. This is for justice." The broadcast continued, with Sarah and Tom adding their own accounts of what they had witnessed. By the time they finished, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had done it. They had exposed Victor Kaine to the world. But their relief was short-lived. As they left the studio, Mark's phone buzzed. He answered it, his face paling as he listened. "We've got a problem," he said, hanging up. "Kaine's men are on their way. They know where we are." James's heart sank. "How?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." They moved quickly, piling back into the van. Sarah hit the gas, speeding away from the building just as a convoy of black SUVs turned onto the street. "They're following us," Tom shouted, looking out the back window. James clenched his fists, his mind racing. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. "We need to draw them away from the city," Agent Morales said. "If we can lead them into the open, we might have a chance." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the wheel. "There's an old industrial park outside the city. It's abandoned. We can lose them there." James glanced at Tom, who gave him a grim nod. They were in this together, no matter what. As they sped toward the industrial park, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the final showdown. They had exposed Victor Kaine, but now they had to face the consequences. When they reached the industrial park, Sarah pulled the van into a large, empty warehouse. They jumped out, taking cover behind stacks of crates as Kaine's men surrounded the building. "We're trapped," James whispered, his heart pounding. Tom shook his head. "Not yet. We've got the high ground. We can hold them off." Agent Morales pulled out her radio. "I've called for backup, but it's going to take time. We need to buy ourselves some breathing room." James nodded, his resolve hardening. They had come too far to give up now. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the wind outside. James crouched behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding as he peered into the darkness. Kaine's men were out there, surrounding the building, waiting for the right moment to strike. James could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Tom was beside him, his gun trained on the entrance. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "They'll make their move soon." James nodded, gripping the fire extinguisher he still held. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all he had. He glanced at Sarah and Agent Morales, who were positioned on the other side of the warehouse. They looked just as determined as he felt. The sound of footsteps echoed through the building, and James's breath caught in his throat. He could see shadows moving in the darkness, creeping closer. Kaine's men were inside. "Get ready," Tom murmured, his finger hovering over the trigger. James's hands were sweating, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had been through worse. He could handle this. The first shot rang out, and chaos erupted. Kaine's men charged into the warehouse, their guns blazing. Tom returned fire, taking out 2 of them before they could react. James swung the fire extinguisher, knocking another man off his feet. The room was filled with the sound of gunfire and shouting, but James forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Agent Morales and Sarah were holding their own, using the crates for cover as they fired back at Kaine's men. But they were outnumbered, and it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. "We need to fall back," Agent Morales shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Tom nodded, grabbing James's arm. "This way." They moved deeper into the warehouse, using the maze of crates and machinery to their advantage. Kaine's men followed, their footsteps echoing behind them. James's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to keep going. They couldn't stop now. They were so close. As they reached the back of the warehouse, James spotted a door leading outside. "There!" he shouted, pointing. Tom nodded, kicking the door open. They spilled out into the night, the cool air relief after the chaos inside. But their relief was short-lived. Victor Kaine was waiting for them. He stood in the middle of the parking lot, flanked by more of his men. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto James, and a smirk played on his lips. "You really thought you could stop me?" Kaine said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a pawn, James. And now your little game is over." James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "This isn't a game, Kaine. This is justice." Kaine chuckled. "Justice? You think the world cares about justice? Power is the only thing that matters. And I have all the power." Tom raised his gun, aiming it at Kaine. "Not anymore." Kaine's smirk faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. "Kill them." His men raised their guns, but before they could fire, a loud roar filled the air. James turned to see a convoy of black SUVs speeding into the parking lot, their lights flashing. The doors flew open, and federal agents poured out, their guns trained on Kaine's men. "Federal agents, drop your weapons," one of them shouted. Kaine's men hesitated, then slowly lowered their guns. Kaine's face twisted in rage. "You think this changes anything? You can't stop me." Agent Morales stepped forward, her voice firm. "It's over, Kaine. We've got the evidence. The whole world knows what you've done. You're finished." Kaine's eyes darted around, looking for a way out. But there was none. He was surrounded. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. "This is for everyone you've hurt, Kaine. For everyone you've destroyed. It's over." Kaine's face contorted with rage, but before he could say anything, the federal agents moved in, cuffing him and leading him away. James watched as Kaine was shoved into the back of a car, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. As the chaos died down, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. They had done it. Sarah walked over to him, her face filled with relief. "We did it, James. We stopped him." James nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, James. I'm proud of you." James smiled, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't felt in years. He had faced his demons, and he had come out stronger. In the days that followed, the evidence against Victor Kaine was made public, and the fallout was swift. Politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials were arrested, their ties to Kaine exposed. The city was in shock, but for the first time in years, there was hope. James became a symbol of resilience and justice, his story inspiring others to stand up against corruption. He continued to work with Sarah and Tom, helping to rebuild the city and ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as Kaine was led away in handcuffs, James felt a sense of peace. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm golden glow across the skyline. James stood on the rooftop of a small building, looking out at the bustling streets below. It had been 6 months since Victor Kaine's arrest, and the city was slowly healing. The corruption that had once festered in its core had been exposed, and though the scars remained, there was a sense of renewal in the air. Sarah joined him, leaning against the railing. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything we went through, it's almost hard to believe it's over." James nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, but it's not really over, is it? There's still so much work to do." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes filled with admiration. "You've done more than anyone could have asked for, James. You've given people hope. That's not something everyone can do." James sighed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I just wish it didn't take so much to get here. So many people got hurt along the way." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "But because of you, fewer people will get hurt in the future. You've made a difference, James. Don't ever forget that." James looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, or Tom, or Agent Morales. We did this together." Sarah smiled. "Yeah, we did. And we'll keep doing it. Together." Downstairs, Tom was busy organizing a community event for veterans, something he and James had started to help those who had served their country but felt forgotten. It was a way to give back, to honor the sacrifices so many had made. James had found a new purpose in helping others, and it gave him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Agent Morales had been promoted for her role in bringing down Kaine's empire. She continued to work tirelessly to root out corruption, ensuring that no one could ever wield the kind of power Kaine had again. She had become a mentor to James, guiding him as he navigated his new role as an advocate for justice. As for Victor Kaine, his trial had been swift and decisive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His empire had crumbled, and his name had become synonymous with greed and corruption. But for James, Kaine's downfall wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that no one else would suffer at his hands. That evening, James stood in front of a small crowd at the Veterans Center, his heart full as he looked out at the faces of those he had fought for. They were the reason he had kept going, the reason he had never given up. "We've been through a lot," he began, his voice steady. "But we're still here. We're still standing. And that's what matters. No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, we keep fighting. For ourselves, for each other, and for the future." The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. He had come a long way from the man who had stood in that courtroom, disrespected and dismissed. He had found his voice, and he was using it to make a difference. As he stepped down from the podium, Sarah and Tom were waiting for him, their faces filled with pride. "You did good, James," Tom said, clapping him on the back. "Really good." Sarah smiled. "I'm proud of you." James looked at them, feeling a surge of emotion. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." As the night wore on, James found himself standing on the rooftop again, looking out at the city. It was a different city now, one that was healing, one that was full of hope. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, James knew they would face it together. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning, and James was ready.